Secretary last week over the sacking of 800 British workers in 2022. The Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy's, told LBC she welcomes the investment.
What happened to P&O workers cannot be allowed to happen again. But we're really pleased that DP World is here, that they're investing in the UK. Our message is absolutely clear. Britain is open for business. We're pro-worker, we're pro-business, and because of that, we're pro-Britain.
The father of a 10-year-old girl has admitted killing her before fleeing to Pakistan in August last year. Sarah Sharif was found with dozens of injuries at home in Woking in Surrey. Rapper Sean Diddy Combs has been hit by a new batch of lawsuits accusing him of sexual assault against 6 people, including a 16-year-old boy. He's accused of raping women, sexually assaulting men and molesting the boy. And it's reported none of Australia's state premiers will be attending a welcome reception for the King and Queen when they travel to Australia. Charles and Camilla are due to leave on a 9-day tour later this week. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 39 points at 82.92. The pound buys $1.30 and €1.19. LBC weather mainly dry tonight, just a few spots of light rain in places and a low of 0. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to Monday's Cross Question. It's coming up to 2 minutes past 8 here on LBC. Let me introduce my panel to you. We have Anna Firth to my left, the former Conservative MP for Southend West. Next to her, Gawain Towler, long-time former advisor to Nigel Farage during his time as leader of UKIP, the Brexit Party and Reform UK. To my right, Martha Gill, columnist for The Observer. And to her right, Zack Polanski, deputy leader of the Green Party, who is also a member of the London Assembly. They're here to take your calls. The number to call 0345 6060 973.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's start off with a call from James in Chelsea. James, hello.
Hello, yeah, good evening, Ian. Thank you for taking my call. Good evening, panel. My question is it right that Lucy Haig has had the slap down that she's had, considering what she said? We were all thinking back. Well, we were all thinking what she sort of said back in the day.
She called DP World a rogue operator, which was slightly unfortunate given they were about to announce £1 billion investment into the UK economy, expanding the port at Thames Gateway. Zack Polanski, let's start with you.
Well, Louise Haig was totally right. In fact, I thought the Labour Party or the Labour government had finally found its backbone. She's right. They were a rogue trader. We saw just last year P&O Ferries sack 800 employees, and they were rehiring people who were not even being paid a proper wage. So I think the fact that the Labour Party, and the clue is in the title, they should be about the working people, are actually backing huge financial investments at the expense of working people shows quite how they've lost their way.
That's totally illogical, isn't it? Because if £1 billion investment will presumably mean hundreds of new jobs in North Kent, that's a good thing.
Well, I think there's lots of other ways of creating those new jobs, and actually what we ultimately need to be doing is tackling inequality in our society. We have multimillionaires and billionaires earning more money than ever before, and this is just a movement of public funding essentially.
So you don't really want any extra investment in this country? You don't agree with this summit taking place?
I really want investment in this country, but the investment should be good investment that's tackling the climate crisis, that's good new jobs that are in trade unions, that are paid proper wages with fair working conditions, but ultimately giving the money to rogue traders is completely the wrong way, and Louise Haig was absolutely right.
Wow. Martha Gill.
Well, this goes to the heart of Labour's problem or dilemma, which is balancing workers' rights, which is something they promised in their manifesto, with wanting to be the fastest growth in the G7, which is a difficult balance. They have actually tightened up the rules, which mean that a repeat of the P&O scandal will be less likely to happen now. But I think what the government was doing, what Starmer was doing in distancing itself from that sort of inflammatory rhetoric, was trying to go to the other side and welcome investment. And indeed, once they did that, DP World has gone back on what they threatened to do, and they have actually invested. So I think this is just an example of the kind of compromise that Labour has been trying to do throughout this investment conference today.
Anna Firth.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's completely the wrong thing to say at completely the wrong time, and I bet the phone lines were red hot over the weekend. I mean, it was clear, wasn't it, over the weekend that the government was distancing itself from her comments. That's not to say that she didn't have a fair point at the time when DP World were hiring and firing, but it was condemned at the time, and there was plenty of debate about it.
Your government did nothing about it.
There was quite a lot of discussion about it at the time, and that it's certainly something
Grant
that we would have
talked very tough, but in the end did nothing.
Well, I mean, there is a timeline here, and I don't know what might have been planned, what action might have been planned. I don't know what was in Grant's head. You're right that nothing actually changed at the time. But the point here is, here today we had a major investment summit. Whatever colour you wear, we wanted to talk up Britain today, and that was a very unhelpful comment over the weekend.
Gawain?
It just seemed to be, to me, another unforced error on the part of the government. They seem to be making more unforced errors than an England football side. But the fact is that...
If you'd said that last week after we lost to Greece, that would have been a really good point to make, but not after we won 3-0 the other night.
We still make them. But anyhow, the point being is, yes, what the Minister said back then, I think was correct. But there is something of the schoolboy politics, the schoolgirl politics, the sixth form debating society about much of what this government seems to be doing right now. And that isn't helpful. Again, as we've just made very clear, the fact is that the DP World has changed its mind. It has decided to invest. I don't know if we can guarantee that yet. Many times we see these summits, many times we see these events when people make lots of big promises and nothing actually happens. So I think the proof of the pudding of these investments will in fact be in eating. You talk about lots of jobs in the North Kent corridor. Yes, ideally, but let's see them happen before we applaud the government.
Any of you want to respond to what Zack said? Because, I mean, it's fair, I'm surprised that you haven't already, to be honest. But, I mean, sort of...
there are more jobs than just green jobs.
Yeah, no, I think that we do want to be attracting this sort of investment into the country. I can't help but observe the volte-face in the rhetoric today with what Rachel Reeves was saying a month ago when she was saying the worst inheritance since World War II, and now the future of Britain has never been brighter. So let's hope we're going to get some measures in the budget that reflect the latest rhetoric. I suspect we won't. But of course we want to see this investment, and of course DP World is a major player in the Thames estuary. And yes, we want decent employment practices, but no country wants to put off major international investment. Of course, this £1 billion was in the pipeline. This isn't none of this investment that we've heard today. This 63 billion has suddenly been magicked up in a few days. These are multi-million pound businesses. These investments will have been in the pipeline for months, if not years, in some cases.
But and I think one also has to talk about the disinvestment, and that is the place like Port Talbot and Grangemouth. And what we're seeing is government policies that, and it's not just this government. Again, just as good decisions have come through the pipeline, bad decisions have come through the pipeline, and this government is following the last government in its deindustrialisation strategy. And it's not as if that steel isn't being made. It's not as if that oil isn't being bubbled up through cracking towers. That's happening. We'll just have to import it. So the net zero agenda is driving people to disinvest in large parts of the country. So I would, it's all very well bigging up this and what's happened today, but elsewhere in the country, we're seeing something much, much more concerning, particularly in places like the east of Scotland and the southwest of Wales, where a culture of hard work is being dissipated by a government that doesn't seem to be interested in it.
Zack?
I agree with some of what you've said, which I didn't expect us to be agreeing across the table quite so soon. But places like Port Talbot did lose tens of thousands of jobs, and this was entirely foreseeable. And ultimately, if we're going to look at this just transition, this idea that if we're tackling the climate crisis, people need good green jobs that are transitioned properly, and also care jobs as well, frankly, then we should be making sure that these jobs are there. Otherwise, it's just a ticking time bomb. I would object to the idea of sixth form or high school politics. I think some of the best people I often debate or hear talk are in sixth form. so I'm not going to dismiss sixth form politics, but I think ultimately young people, when they hear about cutting the red tape, they know that too frequently means deregulation, which means trampling on workers' rights or environmental regulations. So yes, we need big investment in this country, but it's got to be the right kind of investment, and we can't just accept money because you've got to ask at what cost.
Right, follow-up text here from Jamie, who says the Transport Secretary comments on a transport matter, but apparently what she says isn't the government's view. Please, can someone on the panel explain that? Any volunteers? Because I'm not going to.
I think we all know this is about time and place, isn't it? It's the fact that it was an unhelpful comment just before this major event. So of course the government doesn't want a major player being put off, and all the adverse publicity that would go along with that. It was an ill-judged comment, wasn't it? I think what we're seeing, and I agree with what you were saying about unforced errors. A lot of this is a government that's still very new in power, and not completely yet recognising the difference between being in opposition and actually being in government, and the sort of off-the-cuff remarks that you can make in opposition, which I can now make now that I'm not an elected member of Parliament, are not appropriate, are they, when you're a Minister of the Crown?
Although you have to compare it to the previous government, where you look at the way that ended, the number of off-the-cuff coments which were being made by people on a daily basis.
That was at the fag end of a useless government. I don't think anybody on this panel, and I'm sorry, it may have been painful, but anyone on this panel did not know 2 years ago that Labour was going to win this election.
No, but
they've had 2 years to get themselves together, 2 years to sort themselves out, 2 years not to be shocked by being in power. And I think you're right, the fag end of the Conservative government was a mess and everybody was briefing left, right and centre, absolutely. But at the beginning, it wasn't the case. And I think I am deeply surprised that, particularly with Sue Gray on the inside and the outside, they weren't far more prepared for walking into Whitehall, walking into those jobs. They've known for an awfully long time, and yet it is as if, oh my gosh, did this just happen? That's the feeling one gets, and they're making the unforced errors as if they had no idea, as if it was a shock. It wasn't a shock to anybody.
It's very naive, and it's a very immature government. I think somebody said that this government in 100 days has shown itself to be incompetent, on the take, and divided. I wonder who said that.
Well, whoever it was, a bit like the last government then.
Yeah.
And I think, that I think is what a lot of people, I was talking to someone at the weekend who's sort of no particular support of any political party, but they said, well, it's as if there's been no change. In that sort of the freebie thing, you can imagine that happening under the last government, and the incompetence you can imagine happening under the last government. I think there's a degree of disappointment. Your reader's telling you that, Martha.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that particularly, if you look at Starmer's announcement in the Rose Garden that basically everyone coming into government with a far higher moral calibre than the people going out, and then you realise that actually they're just, well, perhaps not just as, but they are also subject to the kind of behaviour that the system of government currently allows. So you can't trust the good character of politicians to police themselves as what the public perhaps are feeling. And in fact, rules need to be laid down for them more strictly. But to Labour's credit, they are laying down those rules. They're making it harder for this freebie scandal to repeat by laying down rules for themselves and subsequent governments. But I have to agree with both of you that the first 100 days have not been...
And how can Mr. Probity, Mr. Rules himself, who told us, any number of times from the dispatch box about the Nolan principles, how can he himself then need more rules? I mean, the hypocrisy here, I think, is really, really
Although if you look at the scale of the scandals in the last government and the scales of the scandal here, perhaps we are...
Went for it. They only just started.
Well, OK, fine. But we are perhaps... judging them more harshly because of what they promised to do and the high standards they set themselves. I mean, this scandal does not compare to the scandals in the last government.
I'm not sure I agree with that. So Quadrature Capital donated £4 million to the Labour Party. They donated it when the election was called in the 1 week window where they wouldn't have to declare it until after the election. They're a hedge fund based in the Cayman Island, and they have connections to arms trade, private healthcare, oil and gas. You know, the whole bad gang are all there together. And I think if you have vested interest from a political party, then the rules can only go so far. This is ultimately about character and who they're being bought by.
But you would say, I mean, presumably the Green Party has donors as well. And you would sit here, no doubt, and say, well, it doesn't matter how much they donate, they don't have any influence on Green Party policy. And that's exactly what the Liberal Democrats would say, it's what the Conservatives would say, it's what Labour says. Why is it different for other political parties?
So if I'm as subjective as I can possibly be about this, I think that...
What do you mean objective?
Objective, sorry. I thought you might just not notice when I said something. Political donations is a huge problem in politics, and we need to change the entire system, because ultimately, yes, your question is totally fair. I would naturally answer that the Green Party don't take huge donations from corporate companies that have problematic interests. But as the Green Party get bigger, that will increasingly be a problem, because people become more interested in a party that gets more power. So we do need a complete change of political lobbying and how parties are funded. But the problem is we're going to need all politicians of all parties to sign up.
What you mean is taxpayer funding of political parties?
Well, I think if that means that we get better public services, that the NHS is protected, that we have a proper policing system.
But why would we? Just because the taxpayer funds political parties?
Because I think we'd have better choices in the interests of people rather than huge corporate companies with vested interests.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, because I don't see any appetite among Labour MP. I mean, we haven't got a Labour MP on the panel, as somebody points out here, saying, Mr Dale, as usual, no Labour representative or the government. After the phone-in you've just had, the government representative would have balanced your panel lineup. Well, we do have a balanced panel every day. We generally have 2 people from the broad right, 2 people from the broad left. Sometimes they're MPs, sometimes they're not. We don't have MPs tonight. Tomorrow, we are promised by Labour a government minister on the programme tomorrow night, and we have a Labour MP on Wednesday, but only one Conservative MP over the whole week. I mean, is that an example of bias? I don't.
There's just 2 of them these days.
They're very busy, working very hard.
One point I would like to make, coming back to this, is that what we have seen since the expenses scandal, 2008, was it? Was we've been trying to legislate people better. We are trying to legislate against human nature. Some people are venal. Some people are weak. Some people make mistakes. And what we seem to be, we are demanding greater and greater levels of perfection from our politicians. And I'm sorry, that isn't how people work. That's not how people are. And I do think that as a country, we are actually remarkably forgiving of error, and we're remarkably forgiving of mistake. What we don't like is hypocrisy, and the reason why this is kicked off is that level of hypocrisy. Okay. Because we get it. People know how it is. People do things that aren't quite ideal.
Right. Well, we
legislate to improve them.
We have another 40 minutes to take your questions. If you'd like to put them to the panel, the number 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
Wills.
Cross Question with Iain Dale. Watch live on Global Player. This is LBC.
19 minutes past 8. Zack Polanski is here, Deputy Leader of the Green Party. Gawain Towler, former Director of Communications for Reform UK. Anna Firth, former Conservative MP. And Martha Gill, not yet former columnist for The Observer. But one day, Martha.
God.
When you're promoted to greater heights. Right, let's go to another question. It's from Keith in Shoreditch. With many of the workers' rights changes not being implemented until 2026, and only after consultation with business interests, are many workers now void of any real political representation? Gawain.
Well, I think the way that the Labour Party charged into working with unions and giving unions pay rises and things of this sort suggests that at least the unionised Labour has some say in what's going on in this country. But to me, the most fundamental workers' right is the ability to get a job. And I feel, I'm talking to, and I have been talking to smaller employers and entrepreneurs and all the rest of it, many of these workers' rights of which we are talking will be discussed with big business, but not so much with small business. And it's small business which employs the vast majority of people in this country, and they are looking at this. I was on the train on the way up here talking to a woman who employs a number of people, and she was just saying, I don't think I can employ anybody else because of the rules and the rights.
You talk to people on a train?
I know, it's strange, isn't it? We were smoking just next to just outside the station beforehand. But the point being is that she's looked at these ideas, these stuff in this legislation that's being brought forward, and gone, I don't want to employ anybody new. I just don't. So surely the fundamental workers' right is to get a job in the first place.
Martha.
I think this is the delay is partly why businesses aren't being quite as frightened as they were initially at the hint that all these rights were going to come through. But I agree that it's a bit of a worry for workers, given that it's all this stuff from probation changes to sick pay to day one rights to flexible working is not going to come in for quite some time.
Anna?
Well, I'm jolly pleased that they're not going to just march ahead with it, because I think many of these measures, there's 28 new regulatory measures, and this is going to be a disaster for small businesses. Southend, West and Lee, that I did represent, in common with so many constituencies, had sort of 98% and above small and micro businesses. So businesses employing only a handful of people, and any extra regulatory burden is very destructive for small businesses. It's an absolute brake on growth. They don't have HR departments. They have to rely on joining up to the Federation of Small Businesses or the brilliant Essex Chamber of Commerce and then getting advice on the compliance. So to have 28 extra burdens, including things like unfair dismissal rights from day one, is just going to massively restrict growth for our small businesses. That's going to be less jobs, and that's going to be basically less wealth for all of us.
Why have the CBI welcomed this package?
Big business, they love it. It closes out small business.
All these things are fine. I mean, I agree with that. All of these things are fine for big businesses with great HR departments, because actually it then crowds out the smaller players. But it's these smaller players that are the backbone of our economy,
Zack.
up and down the country.
There's people working up and down this country who haven't had a pay rise in 10 to 15 years.
Well, this isn't going to do anything for them.
Well, I think ultimately it's going to make sure that people have got better working conditions. I think with the better working conditions, people can make sure that they're organising properly. We need to see what the detail in the bill, and I think, I welcome any changes to workers' rights that are a step in the right direction, so I've got to be fair to Labour to that. But there's a lot of nuance already that does worry me and worries trade unions. So, for instance, rather than banning 0 hours contracts, as they said they were going to do, they're now banning exploitative 0 hours contracts. Now, of course, I'm keen on banning any exploitation, but they've got to explain what the nuance is between that.
Isn't the nuance on that they've come to realise that there are actually quite a few people who like 0 hours contracts, like single mothers or students, for example. So just to ban them all outright would be a bit over the top.
And my understanding, speaking to workers, and I was a gig economy worker before as a politician, so I was the one who was on, indeed, so someone on 0 hours contracts, you realise that there's other ways of having the same flexibility for the worker without doing a 0 hours contract. But ultimately, it's about making sure that balance of power is shifted more towards the worker, because we know up and down the country there are exploited business owners, hopefully LPC is not one of them, who treat their staff badly and don't give them the flexibility that they want. A use it as a way of exploitation. Fire and rehire is another one. We thought it was going to be banned outright, but there's now caveats. So again, it's a step in the right direction, but there's lots of nuance and details that don't sound quite like they've grasped the mantle in the way that they need to.
OK, let's move on to something different. It's from Robbie in Chelmsford. Hello, Robbie.
Good evening, all. My question is, if the Israeli government presses ahead with a starve or leave blockade-type action on the Gaza Strip, what should the UK government response be? Should we sanction Israel? Should we support them? Or should we stay out of it?
No, United Nations report says that no food has entered northern Gaza since the start of this month, putting 1 million people at risk of starvation. Now, you may remember the UK government under Rishi Sunak was certainly pressuring the Israelis to allow more aid into Israel, and I think it did happen for a while. Well, according to this report, it's not happening now. Anna, let's start with you.
And I think not just Rishi Sunak, actually. I think David Cameron was taking exactly that approach. And I mean, what's happening in the Middle East is just the most almighty tragedy. And I think that we all want somehow to believe that at some point that there's going to be a ceasefire and that there's going to be peace again and an opportunity for the international community to try and bring those regional parties together. Clearly, we're obviously 1 million miles from there at the moment. I think that I hope very much that the government will will engage with Benjamin Netanyahu and will urge them in the strongest terms to let the aid through. It cannot be right to have women and children starving who are ultimately innocent victims in this conflict.
Zack?
There's mounting evidence that what we're seeing play out in real time is a genocide. And I was on this programme a few days after October 7th and was calling for a ceasefire. And it's highly emotive to think that a year on, so many more people have unnecessarily died. Of course, we need to release the hostages, and we do need a ceasefire, but we cannot end the violence until we end our own government's complicity. We have ended some arms sales, but I think it's about 35 out of 350, including vital parts for fighter jets that we know now have evidence are committing war crimes. What do we need to do? We absolutely need to make sure that we're clear as a British population that this is not in our name, and ultimately call on our government to put pressure on America, who are the key player in this.
But on this issue of food,
yes.
I mean, I must admit I hadn't seen this. It's actually quite a shocking allegation that the UN are making here, that they're deliberately not providing any food for people in northern Gaza.
I mean, it's absolutely horrific, but it's just another on mounting evidence. I mean, we saw Palestinians being allegedly burnt alive in the last couple of days on Twitter. But, it feels like whenever we've reached the depths of how depraved this war can go, the Israeli government seem to go even worse. And I think at some point, the British government need to take a stand on this. And that point was a long time ago. But I still hope they will stop and reflect and use their diplomatic might again to influence America, because they're the key player in here that maybe Netanyahu will listen to.
Martha?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you. This is absolutely horrific, the idea that civilians are going to be left to starve and aid cannot get through. And I agree the government should do something about it and continue to put more pressure to allow this aid through.
Gawain?
Whilst I would agree to a certain extent with that, I also think there should be more pressure on Egypt to allow Palestinians out of there so they can actually go to somewhere where there is security, safety and food and water and everything you need. So there seems to be the pressure maybe on the Israeli government, perhaps, yes, but also on the Egyptian government to allow people out. So therefore the refugees can leave and be looked after in an area that's not a war zone.
But why would Egypt do that? Because what they would be doing was effectively creating refugee camps akin to what are on the West Bank.
Well, I think for humanitarian reasons, if we are saying that the Israelis must not prosecute the war as they see fit, we should also be pushing pressure on a country like Egypt to allow refugees out. I think it's as simple as that, humanitarian reasons. What other reason else is there?
OK. Right, thank you very much for your answers in the first half of the programme. Lots more time for you to ring in and put your questions to our panel, 0345 6060 973. It's coming up to 8:30 here on LBC News Headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Health Secretary has told LBC the government's deal with the owner of P&O Ferries proves you can be both pro-business and pro-worker. Wes Streeting says DP World's investment shows the government's strategy is the route to pro-growth. The father of a 10-year-old girl has admitted killing her before fleeing to Pakistan in August last year. Sarah Sharif was found with dozens of injuries, including bruising, burns and broken bones at home in Woking in Surrey. And the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says his troops will continue to target Hezbollah in all parts of Lebanon. He was speaking at a military base hit by Hezbollah drone strikes yesterday. LBC weather mainly dry tonight, just a few spots of light rain in places and a low of 0.
This is LBC.
Vice.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:32, Zack Polanski, Gawain Towler, Anna Firth and Martha Gill with us answering your calls. Gawain, I have to ask you, you were recently let go by Reform
Indeed.
UK. It surprised, shall we say, a great deal of people in the sector. What happened?
I think we have a new setup post-election. There's this desperate move towards, not desperate is the right word, but a considered and concerted move to create a party more than we had before. And we're creating, hundreds of branches, literally hundreds of branches from scratch since July the 4th. We had 0. We're now on to about 350 by Christmas. The idea is to have 450 branches. That's a massive business of work. We're looking at various things in, as I say, the professionalisation, the democratisation of the party. And in many ways, my face didn't quite fit that. I have a different style. There's a different way of doing things. And that's fine. I get it. I mean, things change. I can live with that. I was always very lucky. I was a paid activist. I was an activist who happened to get work. Most activists don't get work across the country. There are thousands of people putting huge amounts of hours in to help, and I'm sure it's the same in your party and yours. This is the norm. I was just dashed lucky that some fool gave me the money to do it.
Well, talking of Nigel Farage, I mean, you've been with him for, well, more years than I can count.
Indeed.
I mean, do you not feel betrayed?
No, not at all. He gave somebody a job to do. That person was given a role to make decisions, and he made that decision. Nigel has to back him, of course he does. You can't give somebody a job and then say you can't do that. You've got to give that support, so that's fine. But I've seen Nigel on numerous occasions since then. We are friends. It's actually quite nice not to be in a working relation, but to be in a friendly relationship again. So I'm happy with that.
A lot more sanguine than I think I would be in the circumstances, but well done.
Well, life's too short to get too worried, isn't it?
Right, let's move on to a text question from Scott in West Hampstead. At the forthcoming Heads of Commonwealth Summit, one of the main agenda items will be the demand by 15 Caribbean countries for Britain to pay reparations for its role in the slave trade. Should Britain pay reparations, and if so, what form should those reparations take? Just an apology? ? Well, the PM spokesman insists no reparations will be paid. Martha?
It's interesting. I mean, it's the same lines the previous government made. This is not a question, but the ground is shifting on this. I mean, earlier this year, you had the Church of England saying it would pledge $1 billion towards its role in slavery. Commonwealth countries are now acting together with one voice to kind of call on for reparations. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has previously said he's in support of reparations, although he's, not said that since they've been in government. And so it's a sort of interesting question. I mean, the arguments for not paying reparations are practical because actually the calculations have been put in the trillions. So it's sort of unaffordable. So once you start...
I think Jamaica on its own is claiming 208... Is it billion or trillion? I think it's billion.
Yeah, trillion altogether.
But, it was one of the greatest atrocities of history. This country is built on 200 years of essentially free labour. It left a lot of other countries in the world in poverty. So you can see the arguments for it. But it's I think... the reason that they're not even countenancing an apology is because this opens the door to potentially ruinous amounts of money, right?
I mean, but when you look at amounts in the billions and trillions, you think, well, how on earth would we pay that, and over what period of time? Anna?
Yeah, I think this would be the most ridiculous thing to do. Unfortunately, history is littered, isn't it, with examples of behaviour and brutality which we wouldn't repeat today. Obviously, the slave trade is one of the worst examples of that. But first of all, the amounts being asked for are completely and utterly unaffordable. I think that at the lower end of the scale, it's around £205 billion, the entire NHS budget for 1 year. And I think at the upper end of the scale, we're in the trillions of pounds, which, it would bankrupt the country. So it's not even a starter. But also, no amount of money actually can compensate for what went on, because an awful lot of the people who were involved have obviously passed away. So it's
all of them.
Exactly. So arguably you've got generations and generations, but so it's a meaningless. It would be a meaningless figure. But it would set a precedent, which would be...
What about an apology? Because apologies, I think... I mean, often when politicians make them, they mean absolutely nothing, but sometimes they really do. And I think back to David Cameron's apology for Bloody Sunday, and that really meant a lot, I think, to the Republican community in Northern Ireland, particularly in Derry, Londonderry, or whatever we should call it in these circumstances.
They were still alive, many of them.
They are. That is true. But I think if you look at some of the countries that were affected by slavery, you could argue that even just an apology, even if there were no financial reparations, would make some sort of difference to them. And I mean, I say this bearing in mind that we are a panel of 5 white people here.
Oh, I agree with that. And I think, wasn't there an apology made, I think it was David Cameron again, in relation to some conduct in India?
He refused to say sorry. But it was one of those sort of non-apologies.
But there was an attempt to show some empathy and understanding.
Amritsar massacre.
That's it, the Amritsar massacre. So I think language is really important.
Okay. Zack?
So speaking as a Jewish person, and obviously the Holocaust is in my ancestry, that there has essentially been apologies and reparations for that. So I think the principle of the fact that whole generations of people have been brutalised means an apology is the very least that a government can do. Now, I'll make the case for reparations in a moment, but I would say even before that, for the Labour government to say this is not a question, or we're not going into that question, I think is deeply insulting to many marginalised communities, both in this country and around the world, to not even countenance for discussion. Now, I can understand politically why he doesn't want to go there, because then it opens up a whole set of questions, but I still think it's a really dismissive and, quite frankly, insulting thing to say. When it comes to reparations, it doesn't just have to be financial. We could look at things as simple as the British Museum, where they say, you know, the artefacts are so important and every artefact is accounted for. But there was a story, I think, just last year or 2 years ago, that staff had been selling off artefacts on eBay and no one had even noticed. A museum
one particular member
of staff. There's other museums that have done the right thing and said, OK, we're going to return the artefacts because, I think as Stephen Fry put it, all the arguments aside, it's just the decent and right thing to do, to say, as part of our collective humanity, let's return these belongings from countries that we've pillaged in the past. Admittedly, not our generation. I'm not asking anyone personally to apologise from in living lifetime, but this is about how things have been obtained. I think when it comes to money, I don't think it's something that should be discounted outright. Up until 2015, people were still paying off slave plantation owners, and so there is a precedent here that we can give reparations just to the wrong people. So I think this all needs to be a live and active conversation. And crucially, I think your point is really well made, that it's ultimately the people of colour who need to be at the front of that conversation and leading it.
Gawain.
I'm going to agree with the government. No, I think a couple of things.
I'm sorry, we don't have a shower outside for you to use.
Yes, later. A couple of things. Firstly, slavery has been a part of all aspects of human society throughout history, until one country, spending an awful lot of money, which we were paying back until only 2015, spent a massive amount of money and risked lives. Blood and treasure was spent stopping it. The first society to do so. Before that, this continued. This continued in many parts of the world until we, and lastly, a couple of other countries joined us, stopped this. This is not... Britain was involved in the slave trade, make no bones about it, but it was the first country that said no. And for us to sit there and pay reparations at this point, 200 years after the event, nobody is alive, nobody is involved. I think the absurdity of Gladstone's portrait has to come down because his father was involved in the slave trade. Good Lord, Gladstone was the most liberal. He fought against it. He stood up against, with Prince Albert, to stop Britain being involved in the American Civil War in defence of the South. We did not do that. For this sort of... It's a virtue signalling with other people's money. And I don't think it is right.
I think the other point,
it's poor
Zack,
people in this country paying rich people in other countries, I'm sad to say.
Do you not think that sometimes it's made out, as Gawain says, as though we're the only country that was involved in this? And of course there were slave owners in Black Africa as well, and what is now modern-day Ghana, Nigeria. I mean, do we then say, well, the Nigerian government... I mean, it gets to that rather preposterous point, doesn't it?
Well, I think that's exactly why there needs to be a conversation, but ultimately we know racism and systemic racism exist both in our society, and I take it in lots of other societies too. But I think having this conversation would be a start to look at healing and reparations, not just about money, but actually about healing a society and saying we are a multicultural, diverse society where people have all sorts of backgrounds and ancestry, and it's about time that we faced up to the conversations about how we got here.
I find that we're constantly talking about these things. Constantly.
Not in a way that centres the voices.
Be the way that you discussed the museums thing, with the BLM business. There's constantly, if you look at the TV, there's constant discussion, there's constant changing of our history by the way that historical fictions are created. We're constantly having this discussion. It's going on, and will continue to go on, and that's fine.
I mean, if we want to be proud of our history as having stopped this, or one of the first countries having been influential in doing that, then don't we want to continue that legacy by taking the lead on this and perhaps,
why would we
apologising and then therefore influencing...
Why would we beggar ourselves? How can we ever... Only a rich country can be green. Only a rich country can be caring. Only a rich country can pay for pensions. Why would we beggar ourselves?
Well, it's a moot point because we cannot afford these reparations. So we...
Well, we don't know what level... we know what level the Jamaican government is suggesting, but clearly they're chancing their arm.
Of course they are, but I can understand, and I thought... the King has made some sort of apology, and maybe that might be a way of doing it, rather than as the head of state. Maybe
Should we
that would be the
bankrupt
right
the
way.
king?
No, I'm not talking.
Zach would agree with that.
As the head of state, maybe they make you some sort of apology rather than the government. Maybe a way forward.
No, I see the point you're making that these are Commonwealth countries, and the monarch has a very special place and role, and might be the right diplomatic voice in this instance. But no, we should be proud of the good things we've done in our history, as has been mentioned, in actually taking the lead in abolishing the slave trade. That's where our energy should be, not I'm afraid, in always apologising for everything we've ever done, even though our values are completely different today.
To come to a point of consensus, I think for the king to make a speech about race and about colonialism and empire and some sort of apology, I think would be a very powerful moment in British history indeed. So I definitely take that and start with that.
Yeah, I agree that this policy of just ignoring it and saying we don't do reparations is not good enough, and they do need to make an apology, and then it doesn't have to be a slippery slope to paying trillions of pounds. Some compromise can be found.
I'd say the idea of the Church of England doing what it is promised to do, when the churches across the country are closing, when they are sacking vicars, when they're sacking all the rest of it, they're breaking down all the social work and all the good work they do.
Well, that's because there's less demand, because there's fewer people are religious in this country.
Well, there's still a lot of demand for for what they do, and there's still a hell of a lot out there.
But also, it's been rejected.
And all the rest of it.
It's also actually been rejected.
But that seems to be, there's a self-hate aspect to it. There's a self-immolation. One of the reasons why the church has reduced so much is because they keep on sacking their vicars, because they're trying to raise money to do DIE-style things like this, and it seems to be absurd. But I think
you'll find the amount of money that
self-hatred is very British. It's a lot. We have a long tradition of it. It's what makes us so good. We don't have to hold tight to ourselves and assert ourselves. We can think about equality and diversity. It's okay.
Well, we've got 15 more minutes to hate ourselves, and then we'll hate the answers that we each give in the next few questions. It's 8:46.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Zack Polanski, Gawain Towler, Anna Firth and Martha Gill here to take your calls. Well, here's a WhatsApp question from Vaz in Warwick. Is an increase in tuition fees inevitable, as university leaders repeatedly claim? Or do you think the Minister for Higher Education, Jackie Smith, can get Vice-Chancellors to cut down on claiming expenses? Now, an investigation by the newspaper has found that bosses of leading universities have claimed a combined £1 million in expenses over the past 2 years. Despite earning more than £42 million between them, 2 in 5 universities in England are expecting to run a deficit this year. Meanwhile, the University of Bristol has been criticised this evening for increasing the fees for its master's courses in anthropology by 50% for the 2022 to 23 academic year, before cutting almost half that increase off the cost again a year later. You're cleverer than me if you followed that one. Zack, let's start with you.
Universities should be a right and not a privilege, and I think it's outrageous that we have tuition fees at all, never mind them going up and up and up. And it feels like the government have been trying to slowly paint this picture of inevitability in the same way that they have with lots of public services. They talk about how broken it is. We hear this with the National Health Service. And then whether it's PFI...
Well, it's the universities saying this, not the government.
Well, because the universities are looking for more money, right? And so I think the fact they're looking for more money is true. They're badly underfunded, but we have CEOs or chancellors of universities taking far too much money home, whilst university students are being really penalised. Ultimately, we should be looking at public investment. So I'm glad to see the government starting to talk about borrowing to invest now. That's one conversation we have, but we also need to be talking about money creation. The fact that we talk about the national debt, but really what we're talking about is money that is in our economy. And when people have assets that aren't taxed, that's keeping things stagnant. And ultimately, we should be getting money moving around the economy, investing in our universities, because that's the way that we level up everyone, and that's actually how you grow an economy.
But in virtually every answer you've given this evening, you've wanted to spend a lot more money on something or other. But in your first answer, you didn't want more international investment in the country. I mean, in the end, if you're going to spend more money, it's got to come from somewhere, either borrowing or through growth. Surely the preference ought to be for growth.
Well, there's a good question about where money comes from, and money is ultimately created by the government, so we can make as much money as we want.
Well, in your world, the magic money tree, that's where it comes from.
Well, there is a magic money tree, and we've seen that in various ways. We saw it during COVID, that suddenly we were able to produce the money that we needed. Now, if you do it like
so that's increased the national debt to 2.7 trillion now.
Well, it's really worth reading The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, because that's a whole other set of questions here. But I think the wider point here is that if you're raising money and you're investing, so you're borrowing to invest or you're creating money to invest, that is good for the economy, and that is actually the best way to get growth moving. If you do it like Liz Truss did it and you borrow money to unfund tax cuts, that's how you crash economy. I'm not talking about that. I'm ultimately talking about making sure we're investing in things, and one of the best things we could invest in is public education.
Gawain.
Right, I think that the university sector is vastly bigger than it should be. I think the ambition to have 50%, 70%, 80% of children to go into university is overstated and, frankly, damaging. It creates huge amounts of debt. It locks them into horrible penury for many, many years. I think when we look at universities, look at the investments they make internally, they seem to be spending more money on the student experience rather than the teaching experience. And you see academics being sacked in order that you can spend more on the student union bar, because that way they get decent reviews in some kiddie link websites. So actually, I think the whole thing is a mess. And frankly, okay, they shouldn't be blagging the expenses so much, but 1 million is not going to make a blind bit of difference to not a single sixth form college, let alone the entire university sector. But no, we are trying to do too much. We are pushing people in to do things that they should not be doing. We are getting them into massive debt. I think the entire sector needs a complete overhaul. And further education isn't for everybody. It is more academic. People should be looking at that. And frankly, I think we have, and this is since the Blair years, and I think it has been increasingly damaging. And right now, the only way university can do it is to ship in lots and lots of foreign students, which in many universities is driving the prices up for local students and pushing them out. So the whole thing is
actually subsidising local students.
It is subsidising to an extent. But if you're doing that while at the same time cutting academics, which is happening up and down the country, then there's a massive problem.
Martha.
I mean, our universities are the stars in our crown. We are internationally known for our universities, and it's but they're really underfunded. Some of them are like 40% in debt at the moment, and I have to disagree with Zack. I think that countries that publicly fund the universities have to really restrict the number of people going to university. And, tuition fees are actually quite progressive because people who've been to university earn far more than people who haven't been to university. They don't have to start paying them off until they earn more than £25,000. And so I think it's fair enough. And actually, tuition fees have shrunk because there's a cap on them compared to inflation. So that's part of what's holding universities back. Also, this cap on international students who are subsidising it for everyone else. But yeah, and I just go with you because I think we're also known for our economy is based on people who have been to university and have those skills, and so it's massively increased your life chances. It hugely it's very good for society.
I recall when the 50% target was set up, and it was and I was watching, I think, Daily Politics, and the higher education minister at the time, Blair's one, told us and made one of your arguments, which was graduates get 50 in the top 25% of earners. So we need 50% of people to be in the top 25. And I just thought the maths here isn't working. If over 50% the prices go down.
No, absolutely not. I've got 3 young people who've all been to university or some still at, and £9,000 a year is absolutely ridiculous for these tuition fees. If you look at the Open University, their fees are in the region of £1,500 a year. So that shows the degree to which
they don't have the overheads.
But that level of discrepancy, is huge, and I just don't think these tuition fees are delivering value for money. I don't think it's right for 50% of people to be going to university, to be lumbering our young people with these huge amounts of debt. Of course, these fees are not inevitable, and I hope the government actually sticks with its manifesto promise, which was not to put up tuition fees.
OK, let's move on to a text question from Gordon in Hampstead. Alex Salmond seemed to keep open the possibility of a rapprochement with Nicola Sturgeon at some point in the future. Sturgeon, for her part, seemed less keen. When is the right time to bury the hatchet for politicians? Should they ever? This all came from Edinburgh Fringe Show's interviews that I did with Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, and I asked her, did she think that there would be some rapprochement in the future? And she just said no. Whereas Alex Salmond, I mean, he didn't say there would be, but you could tell that he'd have quite liked there to have been. Martha?
When's the right time to bury the hatchet for politicians? I mean, I think we spend far too much time looking at the personal relationships between politicians, and there's far too much influence of friendships and people being enemies with each other. There's far too much influence of this in politics, and actually, and I think actually worse than enemies, it's friends, people who are loyal to their friends rather than being loyal to the country. And this is where you get all the kind of a lot of cronyism, and then when people are sort of unreasonably hate each other. I mean, it's great for us as journalists to sort of follow these soap operas, but actually it's not great for the country. I think politicians just get over themselves and their.
At least we know what the enmities are. Well, not always, but generally, you know if one politician is at daggers drawn with another. And it makes an entertaining copy for you and me, doesn't it?
It does. But I'm willing to sacrifice that for the good of.
Are you?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not. Zack Polanski, you and I buried the hatchet after your last appearance on this programme, haven't we? So
let's not recreate the argument.
No.
I met the leader of the Danish Green Party 2 weeks ago, and she was talking to me just casually at one point about how she's friends with the leader of the opposition in Denmark, and I said, as in friends, like you have dinner together, and she said, your politics in Britain is so alien to us and the rest of Europe, just the way that you all seem to hate each other. And it just really struck me that I don't think most politicians do hate each other, but I actually totally agree with Martha. I think if people could focus more often on policy and less on personality, we'd have a better kind of politics.
Gawain, briefly, please.
Briefly, I think you're trying to. You can't legislate people. You've got people's characters. In fact, politics is driven by individuals and their characters and how they can show that through how they show themselves in public. And yes, policies are, of course, absolutely vital, but you're never going to take the individual from the from the policy. You're never going to the person who unless you've got AI politicians, and that would be disastrous.
Well, people in other jobs manage to be professional.
Some of the time. I'm sure the people in Observer Towers are always delightful to one another.
Who from your 10 or 15 years being active in Eurosceptic politics do you need to bury the hatchet with?
Oh, virtually everybody, I think. They can be taken out of my back and handed back, I guess.
Anna.
Well, this actually is a perfect example of how it's really important to bury the hatchet before it's too late. Because the thing about burying hatchets and forgiveness and mercy and all of these things is that they bless both parties. Both parties gain from burying the hatchet. But generally in politics, I just wish we could stop playing the person and talk about the principles more. It was a real eye-opener to me, in the House of Commons, just how personal things actually are, and they shouldn't be. We should all be able to have the most robust discussion, but we should all be able to walk out afterwards and all still be friends.
Have you got a personal enemy?
I hope not.
Oh, I have. I'm not going to tell you who it is, though. I'll tell you afterwards, but I'm not going to say it on air. Right, our fun question from Carol in Leeds. Kylie Minogue has recorded 2 bedtime stories for young children to go out on CBeebies. Which superstar would you like to hear reading in person or even an audiobook to you? Zach?
Tom Baker always comes back to
brilliant.
Doctor Who.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Arthur?
I can't remember when I found this out, but Benedict Cumberbatch has a real problem with certain words like penguin, which he can't pronounce, or he pronounces in 10 different ways. So I think it would be amusing to have him read a children's book.
Anna?
Richard Burton.
Well, he certainly had a great voice, didn't he?
An amazing voice.
Slightly before my time, but...
It was not before your time, Ian, at all. You will have watched all the same films as me.
No, I
You're going to be his number one enemy soon.
Yeah, right, Gawain.
I was going to go for Geoffrey Boycott reading The Iron Man.
Oh, my goodness. I want to go for Mary Jane Cullen, who none of you will have ever heard of, but she was a DJ on Radio Broadland when I was at university, and she did the late night show. She just had that wonderful honey-like voice. I don't think she's with us any longer. I hope I haven't killed her off. I'm pretty sure she isn't, but she would be my pick. Now, tomorrow's panel includes the businessman James Reed, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Dame Andrea Leadsom, and the journalist and foreign policy expert Luke McGee. Plus, we're promised a minister from the Labour government. Who will it be? Thank you to all 4 of you for joining us on Cross Question tonight. Coming up in the next hour, a campaigner says Black history should be made mandatory in England schools to combat racism and prejudice. And he says the fact that it isn't has been a partial cause of the riots. Well, if Black history was mandatory in England schools, do you think this would combat prejudice and racism among young people today? Or do you think it's just simplistic guff that the fact that we don't learn enough about Black history contributes to people becoming racist? I'd like to hear your views. 0345 6060 973 here on LBC.